It's a stunning gap. The Parliamentary Budget Office has revealed just how much defense spending needs to be done by the federal government in order to hit NATO's minimum spending targets versus the spending that the Liberal government currently has planned. And according to the PBO, 100% more needs to be allocated. Justin Trudeau pledged to hit NATO's target by 2032. But to do that, the PBO says the defense spending would need to almost double to $81.9 billion a year. The defense minister defended the government's approach.
The PBO, in his calculation, frankly demonstrates far more optimism about the growth of the Canadian economy. I share that optimism, and at the same time, I think it's important that we are working towards the NATO target of 2%. I believe we have to make a significant additional investment in Canada's national defence.
But how much hasn't been made clear. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux joins me now. Thanks so much for coming in. I know when you first saw these numbers, you felt there was something off. What did you find in looking at them in more depth?
Well, we found that the Department of National Defense had used GDP numbers that would imply a 4-year recession, which is something we haven't seen since at least the 1930s in Canada. So they used GDP numbers that are much lower than one would expect, and that are starkly different than those used by the Department of Finance. So that was very unusual and surprising for us.
They say, well, these are the numbers that everyone in NATO uses, so it's fine. But how big of a difference are we looking at when you use those numbers versus Department of Finance numbers?
Well, that results in a difference when it comes to GDP and the amounts of defense spending of about $6.5 billion in difference. So if they were to use the same numbers as we are using for GDP to get to the same percentage of GDP, that would require $6.5 billion more per year in 2030, which is a significant amount of money for defense spending.
Yeah, per year, not overall. Yeah. I mean, you're the Parliamentary Budget Officer. You assess the cost of programs all the time. Often governments get it wrong. Do you often see it off by this much?
Not by that much. And mistakes get made, we understand that. So that's why we flagged it to National Defense before releasing the report. And they said that the numbers are the numbers and they're sticking to their numbers, which was a bit surprising to us because it's obviously a mistake to forecast a recession in Canada for 4 years straight in a row.
Were you able to find those numbers anywhere else to verify what they were basing it off?
Well, DND said these numbers were from NATO, which took it from the OECD. So we tried to find the same numbers and we couldn't find anything that resembles even remotely the numbers for nominal GDP that DND is using. So we were not able to find these numbers.
How significant is this gap and the other requirement that you found, which is that they'd have to double defense spending per year? It's $41 billion for this year projected, have to go to $81.9 billion to hit 2%.
Yeah, that's a significant gap. So the government indicated that it would increase spending, military spending significantly, and they have a plan for that until 2029, 2030. They said that they would have to, they would reach 2% of GDP by 2032-33. So that would mean increasing spending from $41 billion to almost $82 billion, almost doubling, but there's no plan to get to that $82 billion.
No plan to get to there, and would it also mean not having GDP increase at all and not spending more on other programs?
Well, that's the thing. If they want to meet their fiscal anchors, notably a deficit that is lower than 1% of GDP, that would be very difficult to achieve every single one of these years after 26-27. So that would probably mean reducing spending in other areas or increasing taxes.
And probably an unlikely thing for a Canadian government to do of either political persuasion. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Adding even more pressure for Canada to open the coffers is the U.S. election just 2 days away. Donald Trump has said he's told countries who aren't paying their full NATO share that they'll have to fend for themselves.
They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not.
Joining us now is former Chief of the Defense Staff, retired General Tom Lawson. Tom, great to see you.
Nice to be here.
What was your reaction to this news? I can't imagine as it came as a particularly big surprise to you.
No, various think tanks, upon the release of these figures some months ago, recognized that there were some funny things happening regarding GDP. So I think the Parliamentary Budget Officer has largely confirmed that. The question is, how much does it matter?
And I think that is the question. How much does it matter? I mean, obviously, we are already seen as a laggard on defense spending. Justin Trudeau made this commitment. I was there in Washington, D.C. when he said it. He referred to it as a crass political calculation. Didn't seem like something he was particularly into, but he was, getting his arm twisted on. Does it matter whether we hit the 2% or if we're a few billion short?
Yeah, I think there's several ways to look at it. I think the external pressure, which has been growing for a couple of years now, is there. It will be doubled if Trump becomes president again, and there's pressure there. But even our NATO allies have been on to us for a couple of years, seeing as we're one of the very few nations in that partnership now that do not have plans to get to 2%. So the external pressure is there, but the second way to look at it is what's the internal pressure? And until Canada's population, which are largely defense-friendly and have becoming more and more defense-friendly with the rise of various threats out there, Ukrainian war, China as a threatening adversary, more and more supportive. But is it strong enough to be a good platform for either the parties as they approach an election? Third way of looking at it is, what's the right thing to do?
And that, of course, is the question most people ask themselves, and I think a lot of politicians do too. But to your point, the Liberals have taken forever to get here, and it feels very kind of like they've begrudgingly come to it. I was talking to the Conservative Party this week, and I went back to them on more than one occasion and asked them, because they've been critical, of course, Justin Trudeau on defense, saying, well, will you spend the 2%? Will you agree to it? They will not commit. They keep saying they have to look. They give you paragraph-long statements on how the Liberals have messed up defense, but they themselves won't commit to 2%. Is that problematic?
Well, they won't commit yet, and I think they don't want to put themselves into a corner. As you remember, in the last election, defense didn't even come up as an issue. They both avoided eye contact and avoided the entire issue. It may be different this time. If there's a feeling, especially with the American election before that, if there's a feeling that this will become a significant issue for Canada externally and internally, then I think we'll see one of the parties take this on as a platform and finally start discussing about the 2%, getting there and how they would get there. And I think there's a lot of meat that can be discussed there in this being a very positive thing for Canada.
What would a doubling of defense spending look like to meet the 2% target in terms of how it would shape our military and the capabilities there?
Yeah. You remember the reports just a few months ago that talked about 50% reliability and serviceability in a lot of these fleets. That's because we have not filled the parts bins and maintained the operations on the bases, because the first thing that gets cut when you take $1 billion out of the defense budget are maintenance costs and spare parts and things like that. So when you refill all those things and get the bases running, look after the ports and the piers and our depots, and then get all the spare parts so that our equipment's running well. And by the way, there's not a lot of great newsworthy items for political parties to do that, but the response will be that the people in uniform are happy running effectively and efficiently on the bases and providing good, capable arms and options for Canadian decision makers in the future.
And there was that $1 billion cut, because the government was promising more, saying we're spending more on defense. At the same time, they said you can't spend this $1 billion. I know you're very in touch with the defense establishment. What did you hear from people like the former Chief of Defense Staff, Wayne Eyre, who at the time was still in office when this happened, about how that affected the military? Right,
and a lot more commanders and people who are on the ground. Horrific. If you decided not to add many billions in the future, that would be disappointing to people in uniform. But what's horrific to people in uniform is when you take $1 billion out of next year's budget. Money they were planning on using for operational training, money they were planning on using for looking after their buildings and equipment, money they were planning on using for training and sending people on deployments. Horrific. So that has that cannot happen. In the future, when you stop doing that and add several billion a year, so take us from where are we, 1.35, if you could take us to 1.6 or 1.7 right now you've dealt with the bases, the ships that are falling down on deployment overseas, the 50% reliability and serviceability of our aircraft. Now you're closer to 1.7%, and all of that money is staying in Canada. That leaves another 3% to invest in areas that Canada needs investment in.
What are some of the things that we do need to invest in if we theoretically ever did get a government that really got us to 2%?
Right. Well, the defense policy that just came out put a unique and strong focus on the North. And that's for good reason. There are nations out there that really question Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic archipelago. Canada has not done a lot up there. We just think that our history gives us full right to everything up there, even though we don't survey it very well. Our NORAD sensors are all falling apart up there. We don't have a lot of permanent capability up there. And this now says we need that up there. And that's a really strong investment that supports our NORAD partnership with the Americans. So this would be very positive to them. In future, we're going to need some Arctic bases for the Arctic offshore patrol vehicles, which we don't have now. We have to make sure we've got maritime domain awareness and aerospace so that there's really good opportunities for monies to be invested in Canada. These subs that the Liberals...
I wanted to ask you about the subs.
Right. I mean, that's something that I just think is so positive that the Liberals see that this is an investment that needs to be made. We've been kind of out of the submarine game. We've got several that we bought from the British decades ago that have sometimes been seaworthy. But to actually have a dozen subs, not nuclear, no problem, we would be asked, I'm quite certain be asked to join AUKUS. Although we were told that that's only a club for nuclear sub owners, as soon as we have a dozen running and capable subs, that allows us to look after areas off the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast that allows these nuclear sub owners to head up north under the ice where these nuclear subs really run. So I really think that's a fantastic investment. But also ships. You know, our current frigates are falling apart whenever they go out on deployment, and we were planning on buying 15 of these new destroyer-type ships, surface combatants. Not sure we have the money to get 15 anymore. This increase to 2% would allow us to get 15 and to outfit them as we need to for the future.
Of course, I can't let you go without asking you about the American election, because there are security implications potentially for Canada, including if the Americans are distracted with what's happening domestically for them, worries about violence, worries that Donald Trump could decide to say, forget about NATO. As a former chief of the defense staff, where do you see the risks going forward for Canada?
Military risks. I think one of the biggest is that we're not at 75,000. We're kind of at 60,000. 75,000 would barely provide us what we need to look after Canadians in times of national emergencies. And we've seen more and more of those. And we're supposed to be the force of last resort. We're getting called on far more frequently. So I think that's a real risk. But I think the biggest risk is politically. If President Trump becomes president again, what we're going to see is we may see pressure that makes all of these other concerns go away. If you do not go to 2% as quickly as you can, then you will lose a lot of American support in other areas. And that's much bigger than just military concerns, which are significant in themselves.
General Tom Lawson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.